Welcome to the second conversation really between Mark Strom and I on the subject of knowing. In the first talk, what we did was we tried to renovate that word knowing, take it out of its dry, arid intellectual box, take it out of the box that had it as a contrast to faith and the faith reason polarity, and make it a bigger word. And we did that by really linking it to something very intrinsic in human beings, understanding, wisdom, and particularly in the idea that what we're talking about when we talk about the word knowing is truth or light. And to live lives in the light is a great calling of God, but it's not even a religious task. It's a task for all of life, because if we don't walk in the light, if we walk under deceit, if we walk in shadows, then clearly our life is highly vulnerable. So nothing could be more important once you reframe knowledge this way. And we tried to do that in the first talk. This conversation is really a breathtaking sweep. You'll have to, as we often say, or as I often say, put your seatbelt on, because it is really a mesmerizing trip that Mark takes us on. It'll help in the trip if I give you a little bit of a roadmap of where this conversation goes, because like a genuine conversation, the great German philosopher Gadamer said, one of the hallmarks of a genuine conversation is you don't quite know where it's going to go. So having done the interview with Mark, I now know where it went. So he looks at two passages from the Bible. One is Acts chapter 17, the very famous sermon or talk that Paul gave on Mars Hill to a largely non-Jewish audience, to a Greco-Roman audience of skeptics. And the second thing he does is then moves to Philippians chapter 2. And the essence of what he says is this: the instinct in every human being is towards a broader horizon of meaning. The knowing that we seek has a horizon beyond facts and data. And that horizon is well described by this trilogy of words of faith, hope, and love. Hope is the one that is probably most evident in Acts 17. And wonderfully, Paul does not address the crowd as if they have no hope. He actually recognizes the hope they've got, which is evidenced in their idolatry. So he doesn't criticize their idolatry. He actually acknowledges it. And he actually says that it's an instinct. It's an instinct that's noble, an instinct that's towards the good. But it's an untutored instinct. This is the critical point Mark makes, that whilst all human beings have the instinct for meaning and the instinct for purpose, that instinct needs a story to instruct it. As he says, for the Jews, they had the story, but not the ending. And if you don't have the ending of the story, it makes no sense. For the Gentiles, they didn't even have the story. So he doesn't come in saying totally negative things. He comes in acknowledging that as humans, the subtext that Paul has, as humans, made in the image of God, you Greeks are definitely heading in a direction that God wants you to head in a direction of inquiry. But let me tell you the story that makes sense of it. And that story is a story where he goes straight to the end of the story, which is the resurrection. As I've often said about Acts 17, I give people a little test. It's one of the, of course, famous evangelistic sermons in the New Testament, in the Acts of the Apostles. And I ask people off the top of your head, you know what he does not mention in his evangelistic sermon? Well, the answer is he doesn't mention sin, he doesn't mention judgment, and he doesn't mention the cross. he goes straight to the resurrection, because in the resurrection, he declares to these people who worship Augustus Caesar as a demigod, he says, and the ruler of the world, he says, no, look, the ruler of the world is this man, Jesus. He is actually the code that finishes the story. And then Mark takes us into Philippians 2, which is almost an amplification of Acts 17. What did he mean by this? Because Acts 17 is very succinct and abbreviated. But in Philippians 2, the great hymn, the anthem really probably of the early church, this incarnational anthem of a person, a life that was absolutely, in a way, inevitable once you look back, that God would finally communicate to us in a person. And he, in Philippians 2, he widens our sense of the word knowledge into the word wisdom, gives us a bit of a lesson in Greek, phronesis, their word for wisdom. The language Paul's praying, that Paul's using here, and the very famous phrase, let this mind be in you, which is in Christ Jesus. Well, that's a knowing thing, but the word mind is phronesis. Let this wisdom, let this way of looking at the world, let this way of being, which was in Christ Jesus, be in you. And that will be the source of the light you walk in and the blessing you shed abroad. So that's the trajectory of the talk. By the way, on the way, he takes us right back into Genesis 1 and fast forwards into Romans as well. Rehearses the very important theme of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil versus the tree of life. And that these categories of faith, hope, and love are categories that are not good and evil categories. They're categories of life, and they're categories of life that we see evidence in the life of Jesus. So this talk will be one that really will repay a couple of listenings. Enjoy it, and I certainly enjoyed sparring with Mark again. He's got so much to offer us. Thanks, Mark. Okay, hi, Mark.
Hi, Tony.
So we're off on number 2, conversation number 2, where we really looked last time at knowledge and tried to repackage knowledge in a more, I suppose, living way, more relevant way, and that where what we talked about was the way that the word knowledge in our modern society, on both the Christian side and the secular side, has got narrowed down in a variety of ways. One of which is the polarization between faith and reason. And I think that polarization has done nobody a service. So on the Christian side, it's made Christians retreat to the polarity of faith, i.e. experiences, leap of faith, and a characterization of knowledge as almost an optional extra that I would think there would be very few Christians who would put knowledge as an aspect of discipleship.
I know growing up that I often heard it talked about as though it was dangerous for faith. You know, right. It could be destructive of faith.
Yeah, exactly. I think I felt the same way. Whereas, as we have found out, actually the opposite tends to happen, that your trajectory of inquiry and exploration is enriches faith.
Yeah, I remember actually one of my New Testament professors, one that I revered actually, and you know, I'm still very grateful for his contribution to my life and my thinking. But when I mentioned to him about where my thinking was going, this is, what is it now, 30 more years ago, in terms of wanting to understand the Greco-Roman background to the New Testament, you know, influenced by Edwin Judge and others, and just really wanting to kind of paint for myself a picture of what on earth did these things mean, you know, day to day in the first century. And he wrote to me. I wrote to him in a kind of excited way, thinking that he would be really pleased for me and want to, feed into my thinking. But instead, he wrote to me saying, "No one who ever goes down this track ever ends up seeing church the same way." And that was his reason for me to not go there. And I just found that strange on so many levels. Of course, he was right, but that means he was seeking to protect a certain knowledge more than explore where the text and the history might take you.
Indeed. As a matter of fact, coincidentally, this morning, Anne and I were reading Isaiah 50. We're travelling through Isaiah, which is it's kind of, it reminds me of, when you go to these theme parks, you go on these wonderful roller coaster rides. It's exhilarating up the hill and then down. And
yeah, it's definitely got some highs and some lows.
So, but we're reading the servant song where it says, "The sovereign Lord has given me," this is Isaiah 50 verse 4, "an instructed tongue to know the word that sustains the weary. He wakens me morning by morning, wakens my ear to listen like one being taught." And I think that's very relevant to what we're talking about.
Yeah, and it hopefully it'll come out as we move along, whether now or next time. But when I hear that, I just I hear that the category of wisdom is a better way of framing that than the ways we tend to use the word knowledge. Yeah. I mean, I think the word knowledge deserves to have a richer and fuller and sweeter almost connotation, but it so often tends to be cold and boxed. And I think that to the degree to which we still struggle with that, wisdom is a nice way of opening up. And I think it's especially important in trying to understand where Paul goes in his way of unpacking the significance of Jesus's death and resurrection for how we see ourselves and how we see the world around us.
Well, let's kick off on that, because I think what we want to do now is go more deeply into the idea. I think we framed the idea of knowledge being shaped by the coordinates of faith, hope, and love, which changes what we think the word is. And I like what you've just said. I mean, I think that probably the word knowledge is beyond rescue in common parlance. I mean, we've got to keep using it. It's in the Bible a great deal for a start.
Yeah.
But I think wisdom would in common parlance, when you use the word wisdom, people get that it's got to do with some kind of proverbial empathy, street insight, care. It just feels like the word has a more spiritual, moral edge to it than the word knowledge, which has got lost now. It's got hijacked well and truly. So,
yeah, in leadership work, when I introduce the word, people sometimes have the kind of an esoteric idea. It's like the guru on the top of the mountain in isolation. And of course, that's quite ironic, because in all the wisdom traditions across the planet and in all ages, isolation is seen as foolishness, not wisdom. To cut yourself off from other people is not regarded as wise at all. And in fact, all through those traditions, as much as in the Old Testament, wisdom is really about what does it mean to live well. And once you position it that way and saying, how do I need to see myself and to see the world and of course to see God, such that I am able to live well and such that I am able to enable other people to live well. When you frame it like that, people go, oh, of course, this is central. This is really important. And we are still talking about knowledge when we do this.
Well, how about you take us into what you just said about wisdom versus knowledge, or wisdom and knowledge in 1 Corinthians, and you alluded to the fact that when you move to the resurrection, the wisdom word gets prominent. Can you just unpack that a bit for us?
Yeah. So if I start back a little earlier in Acts, when Paul, you know the story of when he goes up on the hill at Athens in the Areopagus, and it's an interesting speech. He starts off, men of Athens, I perceive you are religious in every way, for as I walked through the marketplace, I saw this, an idol to an unknown God. That which you do not know, let me tell you, which is in itself is fascinating, that he assumes they know, which is something he makes a lot of in Romans, in the first chapter of Romans, first and second chapter of Romans. But it's interesting, if you imagine what you're reading at the moment, Isaiah, can you imagine an Old Testament prophet like Isaiah ever positively starting a talk from an idol? Like it's just unthinkable.
Not Isaiah, no.
Yeah, but for Paul, it's a convenient way to begin the conversation. And it's not just a rouge. I mean, I think he's saying, I acknowledge that you do know, but you don't know well enough. And as I'm often fond of saying, it's like for Israel, I think that the sweep of his argument across all of his books when it comes to Israel and the Gentiles is Israel's got the right story, but the wrong ending. And the Gentiles have the wrong story. And for Israel, it's a story that is still waiting for a Messiah to turn up. So they've missed the ending, which is the new beginning, of course. And for Gentiles, predominantly, the story that is current in the first century is about Augustus, Caesar Augustus. As we'll talk about, because it's so connected to the idea of wisdom. Many of the phrases that Paul that are common at that time to talk about Caesar, and particularly about Augustus, who's no longer alive, of course, at that time, but as the savior of the world, as the bringer of peace, as the reconciler of all things. These are words that Paul will transfer to Jesus. Now they do have Old Testament backgrounds as well, but as he often does, he's doing this marvelous thing, which in itself is wise. It's a demonstration of wisdom to be able to draw out of two very different worlds and yet recognize there is something common here. And the commonness, of course, is that we're image of God. The commonness is that we were made to know God and we were made to see the world God's way, which is what wisdom is. And so he's able to go up on Areopagus and say, look, you do know something, but you don't know it well enough. He quotes to them from their own poets, which is fascinating, knows them well enough to pit Stoic and Epicurean against each other while he's talking, and then brings it to the crescendo. But rather than it being in the classic kind of philosophical style of I'm going to drop on you a concept that is going to kind of eclipse your concepts and becomes the sort of focal point for the next round of debate. Instead, what he introduces is the story, and says, this man proved, raised him from the dead, and which of course is just a complete nonsense in a classical frame of mind. If the gods can't get involved in the world without being polluted by it. And if there's anything that exists afterwards, it's this disembodied soul. It's certainly not a resurrected human being. And what he's saying in this is the central point of wisdom. He's basically saying to me, if you want from here on to actually understand life correctly, that understanding has now got to be grounded in this act of God and this man raised from the dead.
Well, this is profound. Let's go into it. What you're saying about wisdom, if I just paraphrase it, is that wisdom for the disciple of Christ has demands a very, very much bigger picture of the sovereignty of God over the whole world and the image of God in all human beings.
Yeah.
So such that we can rename and reclaim God's foothold in every aspect of human life.
Yeah.
Whereas I think what's happened a lot in evangelical Christendom, that broad horizon doesn't exist anymore. It's been replaced by a retreat into a sort of a defensive mentality, a ghetto type. God's here, but he's not there, as it were. Yeah. So for him, he was able to see in Augustus Caesar, rather than seeing him as just a complete competitor, he was saying, and they're idols, rather than seeing them as competitors, you guys are reaching towards something, and you haven't got it. So like a great communicator, he begins with what we've got in common, not with what divides us.
Yeah, and like all who reach towards something but deny the truth, you inevitably set up alternatives, false alternatives.
Yeah, sorry, say that again. I just wanted to get that.
So I'm going with you in terms of that idea of, I think he does see them as reaching towards, and he'll say that in some other places. But if you deny the true starting point, though there's something commendable about the reaching towards knowing, if you deny the true starting point, then what will always happen is you'll set up false alternatives.
Right.
So when they see Augustus, Augustus, of course, makes the claims for himself, but it's like, yeah, that's it. That's almost in a sense,
Right.
that's like the Gentile version of a Jewish longing for a Messiah.
Yeah, so you've got the right instincts, but if you don't get the right story, you'll be utterly open to perilous deceptions.
Absolutely. And likewise, then his critique of his Jewish fellows is that you've got the right story, but you've missed the ending. And for those particularly who are embraced Christ but still trying to hang on to Judaism, he's basically saying, you're muddying the whole story, requiring people to be circumcised and keep dietary laws and the Sabbath, etc., etc. And to the point where he is saying to them, if you persist with this, you've actually lost connection entirely from what it is that God's done. So it's so crucial to go, I need to know the story, and my thinking has to develop from there.
Now, what you're saying about him, I suppose, honouring their grasping towards truth, and he actually uses a phrase somewhat like this.
Yeah.
He says, what does he say? I'm reading from the NIV. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us.
Yeah.
Very, very thought-provoking verse.
Yeah. It's almost like they're not far from us. It's almost like you can imagine Paul pointing back down from the Areopagus, pointing down to the marketplace and say, there he is, but you put the wrong name on him, and further, an idol isn't going to represent him anyway, and
I know, and I was listening this morning to part of a talk from the University of Notre Dame. I think the guy's name was John Betts, but he was part of the David Bentley Hart crew. And in David Bentley Hart's work, one of the things he is moving towards, or not moving towards, but defending the uniqueness of the mind as not being reducible to mechanics of analysis.
Absolutely.
And the particular aspect of the mind, somewhat like Pauline, that he says is the ultimate aspect of mind, is intention. And intention is a poor word for something which, I know as a lifelong lover of poetry and imagery, there is this overreach in every human being, which poetry gets completely. When I look at an object, and I'm never ever really looking at that object merely 100% in terms of its own mechanics. I'm reaching beyond that object to the story it's telling me.
Yeah.
And that broader horizon you could call intent. This guy was saying was actually a reach towards being or meaning. So there's a transcendent horizon in every human enterprise, even the most apparently pragmatic of enterprises, where in order for us to know the truth of the tree, we're looking beyond the tree.
Yeah.
I was looking at a beautiful little gift I was given this morning, some flowers. And you look at the flowers, but in my mind, there's no way that the mechanics of mind is merely at some kind of biochemical calibration of the flowers. It's colour, it's the thought that you gave them. There's an overreach in every object.
Yeah.
And so if we say that's the human mind, that's what Paul is talking about when he said God gave us things so that we could reach beyond those things and find the story behind them, which ultimately getting that story right becomes important.
And in terms of the faith, hope, and love in Corinthians, I love that phrase you used about, reaching beyond. That is hope. That's the very nature of hope, of sensing that there's purpose, there's intent, there's something waiting for us if we are to engage with this well. That's what hope is.
That is very significant. So if we hope, of course, is a word that I think you and I would both know, the modern use of the word hope is a complete reduction and dilution from its New Testament usage.
Yeah, and it becomes a kind of wishfulness. And I've actually, I have come across some in the management world sort of speaking derisively of the idea of hope, that it has no place. And of course, what they're really talking about, and you and I would critique it as well, is this kind of banal, baseless wishing that you and I have seen so many times when people start to do strategy, and they're just throwing out things that they have no conviction about whatsoever. Now, that's not hope.
No. And a very practical example, a significant one on hope as a way of getting to the truth. Because what we're saying is that the richer range of meaning of the word hope, which the New Testament uses, and I like what you've said, is we'll put the word intent. It's a belief in this, what I was talking about. There's a purpose and meaning beyond any event. Now you can get that wrong. That's an instinct we can work with, and Paul was working with it.
Yeah.
But in order to shape that hope, you need the story that explains the hope. Going back to what Isaiah was saying, we Christians need to be, what does he say? The instructed tongues. We need to know. Let me tell you the story. That if we don't have hope, therefore, for instance, if we have skepticism, the very common thing in the world today is skepticism, pessimism, a corrosive cutting down of meaning. We could say those are lies. They're the false. They're as false a story as Augustus Caesar being God was to the Romans.
So here's the interesting thing about skepticism, and this is why, for me, faith, hope, and love have got to be taken together. They're not three parts. They're almost like three perspectives on the one act, the one engagement. Is skepticism in the idea of it's good to question. It's good to look into things. It's good to not just simply be taken along for the ride by whatever. Those are good things. But what you and I know only so well is that this skepticism is always accompanied by a certain sense of elitism. I know better than you. I stand above you, and I will dismiss all of what you say it is wrong. And so I stand apart from you doing this critique. Whereas faith, hope, and love understood together in the context of feeling the need to question something, it does not stand apart. It's that I draw towards you saying, Tony, I'm just not sure about what you said. And I have reservations about it. But I don't want to draw away from you. I want to remain with you. Can we talk this through? But you need to know up front, I'm questioning it significantly. Now, that's an invitation to keep dialogue.
Yeah. And that's got to do with love. In other words, I'm subordinating my questioning to our relationship.
Absolutely.
And there's an other-centeredness in my questioning which honors you.
Yeah, and that's a lovely expression of Paul saying the greatest of these is love. Yeah. So here I am at a kind of epistemological crux, which way am I going to go in my thirsting for knowledge and for truth? And this overriding concern of love comes in and says, I do not want to disengage from my brother, or from anybody else for that matter. So as far as is possible, I'm going to still keep moving towards you, even as I express my reservations.
And that that love has its source in the love for God,
Yeah.
who is the source of all things. So the complete, I've been meditating on this recently to do with the idiocy and arrogance of the question, do you believe God exists?
Yeah.
I've always thought this question is so petulant and arrogant. It's absolutely laughable. The question needs to be, what that question is doing, it's putting a human being in the adjudicating position. This is the skepticism.
Yeah.
I'm actually bigger than God, and I'm allocating to God a part of creation, like I believe trees exist and God exists too. Whereas the truer question is not, do I believe God exists, but rather he is the source of all existence.
Yeah. To go back to Acts 17, when Paul says, in whom we live and move and have our being, that's not a quote from the Old Testament. That's a quote from a classical poet. And he agrees with it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that phrase, just to take that phrase up, because I think it's a very, very, a very agile use of classical wisdom to his ends, has this prioritization that we are subsets of a higher being. Mm. The question is, does he believe we exist rather than do we believe he exists? He is the source of all. We are swimming in something bigger than us. That's what I'm grasping towards, and that's a mindset. I'm swimming in something bigger than me in any inquiry. Now, going back to your point, there is therefore this horizon beyond, no matter whatever I look at. I can remember Michael York, our colleague from a long while ago. Now, Michael did a PhD in biochemistry, the chemistry of the cell. Wonderful listening to him talk about it. Yeah. What was also interesting was his story of the journey. So when he began his PhD, which it took him over 10 years, I think. It took him a long while to do it. But anyway, because he was probably doing it part-time. But he said, what changed from the beginning to the end, let's say it's a 5-year period in biochemistry, was when he began, everyone says, we're almost there. We've almost got it all covered. We'll have the cell in a few years' time, every bit of it nailed down.
Yeah.
What happened in the next 5 to 10 years as he did his PhD was absolutely knowledge increased exponentially, but the horizon receded even more.
Yeah.
And the arrogance had gone, and people said, well, we know like exponentially more than we did 5 years ago, but we're in something that seems infinite. It just seems there's no end to this inquiry. Every question yields more. Now, that could be seen as a sort of fruitlessness. We'll never get there. But what you've just said about love is that love is this complete otherness, and I think in him we live and move and have our being. There is this complete otherness I'm wrapped in. What the story tells us, which we know only the Jews got, is this otherness is utterly benevolent.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's got our good at heart, and there's love behind it all. I mean, you don't actually get to knowledge without knowing that love framed everything.
Yeah, and it's beautiful.
And it's beautiful. It's beautiful, and there's this sense of discovery on almost anything. I was having a lovely talk last night with one of my grandchildren. She's a sweet thing. She's 11. She's going into high school next year. And she's just earnest little industrious, wondrous thing. So I thought, well, what's it going to be like to go to high school next year? And she, oh yes, So I'm thinking this is the opening to 6 years of life and professional development. She said, "Oh, look, I've got my locker sorted out." "Oh, what's happening?" "I'm going to make it aesthetic," she said. So she told me that lockers you get in year 7, they've got timber doors. And she said, "I'm going to take a cutout," because they put artificial turf out the back. "I'm taking a cutout of artificial turf and I'm putting it in the locker. And on one side, I'm having my organizer, and on the other side, I'm having a little tree." So this was her. You look at this. This locker is a microcosm of art for her.
Yeah.
And
And you and I both know that if that instinct and desire in her is not destroyed by education, if somehow or another that is allowed, pardon me, to grow, then that is, you can be assured that her knowing will be rich and true.
It will be rich and true, and there's joy in it. That's where the joy comes from. You said the joy in beauty. I was going to tell a story, because I do want to go back to Acts 17 in a moment, but hope, where you began, that this trajectory of purpose, I think that's a very useful other word for hope that brings it out of its first century context into our context. So there would be this sense of purpose and end to all things. Mm. And that's an instinct in people. People have this instinct that's there. Mm. Can we just go back to Acts 17? I like what you've done with hope as intention and love as this absolutely primary sense of other-centeredness, which finds its root in God. So love is not condescension. Love is a sense that there is an otherness that's actually bigger than me. Yeah. That finds its real source in God. And I think you're pointing to when Paul says, "In him we live and move and have our being," he was able to raid the classical mindset and find that they have an instinct there too. Yeah. But then what you said was, if we don't get the story right, we will be open to deceptions. Idolatry being one, the praise of Augustus Caesar being another. And we know that praise of Augustus Caesar was not an incidental thing, because it was a savage empire, a brutal empire. The story is unlocked, as you said. Israel had the right story but didn't see the ending. Yeah. And whereas the classical people didn't even have the right story to begin with. What you said was, and which I'd like you to sort of develop a bit now, was that the actual ending of the story, we know remarkably in Acts 17, he doesn't actually mention the Jewish concepts of forgiveness of sins and sacrifice for sins. He doesn't go there. He goes to the resurrection and the rule of this man who walked the earth. Mm. And in fact, he says he set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he's appointed. He's given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. So the story, which is the wisdom, is now centered in Jesus, which we can use to recognize, deconstruct, diagnose all of life around us and live well. That's where you were going?
Yeah. So let me go from Acts 17 for a moment to Philippians. Okay. A book that I love and spent a lot of time with many years ago. And there's something in Philippians that speaks to all of this that took me quite a while to realize. There is, in the classical world, when they talk about wisdom, generally in the philosophers, they are, when they talk about wisdom as a kind of some sort of ultimate principle of the universe, they're generally using the language of sophos, the Greek word sophos. But whenever they start to talk about what it means to live wisely, to perceive well, perceive the world, they use a different word. They use the idea of phronesis. And that actually, by the time of the 1st century, that's the word that people are using far more than sophos when they're trying to describe what does it mean for a person to be wise. Now, it's really interesting. Paul does this really interesting thing generally with classical and Greco-Roman vocabulary. There's certain words that he just avoids, like courage, interestingly. And Edwin did some great stuff on this many years ago. He just seems to avoid the word altogether. He largely avoids the word virtue, except that it pops up right near the end of Philippians 4 as one of the last things in a list. In other words, he's dethroned it from the place that it has. And likewise, self-control in the list of the fruits of the Spirit. He's dethroned it from its place as one of the 4 cardinal virtues. So he has this thing of not avoiding certain language. On the other hand, he has this way of taking certain words and turning them into something completely different, such as gospel, good news. And it's a word that was used actually to declare the birth of Caesar.
Ah, right. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and the accomplishment of great acts of Caesar. So Paul and others in the New Testament will take the word and they will happily use it of Jesus. Or another favourite, of course, is mystery, the mysterion. And that's a word that's used sometimes with a philosophical dimension, but most often in terms of the cults, the so-called mystery cults, which often had a very strong connection to the Caesars. And interestingly, Paul always uses the singular, not the plural, but it's always about Christ. He is the mystery, the fullness of all wisdom and knowledge. The mystery revealed now. It's this idea of truth, knowledge, wisdom is not located in these esoteric practices of people sneaking off in the dark. Although actually the mysteries in Greco-Roman life were far more mainstream than often the colourful descriptions sound like. But he's just saying, no, it's an open secret. It's an act that has occurred and here now is truth. Now, interestingly, in Philippians, he takes one of these precious words, one of these key classical words, phronesis. Now, he doesn't use the word phronesis, but he uses the cognate of it, phroneo. And he uses this word repeatedly in Philippians. But the key to it all is that chapter 2, verse 5, where we traditionally translated, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ.
Yep.
And it's the verbal form for now. And what he goes on then to describe, of course, is this amazing story, who although having equality with God, did not regard equality as something to be grasped, emptied himself, to the form of a man, to form of servant, to death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him and gave him the name above every name. The name of Jesus, every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, not Caesar, not Augustus. Jesus Christ is Lord. Now, the story, the story itself is kind of like the complete inversion of the Augustus story.
Absolutely.
So here is God's greatest act of strength, God's greatest act of wisdom. And this, of course, echoes 1 Corinthians with, the inversion of those categories. What looks foolish is actually strength, is actually wisdom. What looks weak is actually strong, etc. And here what he says is, this is the story now. This is the bearing you take if you want to understand life. Okay? To understand all things, here is the story. Jesus is equal with God, but out of love, he lets it all go. And taking the form of death that he takes so that he'll be raised from the dead, and he is now above and beyond all of the imposter Augustus and everybody else could ever claim. Now, the logic of the chapter kind of works in reverse. If you think of the starting point as that story, verses 5 to 11, then 6 to 11, verse 5 is, okay, then let that story now shape your mind.
Right.
Let that shape your mind. Well, what does that look like? We'll go to the preceding 4 verses, Okay. If you have any encouragement, any fellowship, be of one mind, right? Having the same love. And then the real crux of it, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility, consider others more highly than yourself. Now, the big things in the classical world, I often think there's a kind of trifecta at work here. One is the power of Rome, the unquestionable power of Rome. The other is the structures of rank and status, which just color everything in life, absolutely everything in life. And then the other one, which is more philosophical, but it still surfaces a point, which is the whole dualism thing. You know, what really matters and what doesn't matter. And there's nobody particularly walking around thinking about it like Plato, but what they experience, and it's connected with the elitism, what they experience is, because you work with your hands, you are lesser. You are lesser. Just like I think I've said before that, you know, today you get phrases like bogan or westie or whatever as the kind of, you know, some sort of put down by people who live in more affluent places. In the first century, in fact, for a long period through classical history, the equivalent phrase was, he works with his hands. He works with his hands, which is a phrase in 2 Corinthians, Paul gladly uses about himself. You know, in other words, while you're putting me down, let me add fuel to the fire here. So his argument is, if you want to understand what phronesis is, you want to understand what wisdom is today, it begins in this story of Jesus, who has equality with God, but lets it go in order that he might subject himself to life, to death, and resurrection on our behalf. There's the great story. Let that story shape your mind. And here's the proof of it. You will in every way reject those structures. What will transpire in your life is something completely at odds with all of those major structures of society. Now, he does something very similar, I think, in Romans 12, you know, the one that we know so well: do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. There it is again. And what he's basically saying is in those two verses is, in view of the mercies of God, that is, in view of the story I've painted for 11 chapters, if this is true, submit just, you know, no longer, your worship no longer belongs to Caesar, because the language that's used there is the language that was used of your obeisance to Caesar. He said, no longer there, but it's to Christ. And what's the proof of that? Well, don't be conformed to these big patterns, which, you know, when I was growing up was don't drink, don't smoke, don't, you know, whatever. Whereas for Paul, it's not those things at all. You know, it is these big, defrauding, false shaping ideas and actualities, you know, Rome's power and all the rest of it. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And and again, verse 3 following, sorry, what's the proof of that? The proof of it is that your relationships change dramatically. You know, so I say to you, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought to, but think of yourself with sober judgment according to the grace that's been given to you. And he goes on to say, well, you're going to treat each other differently. You're going to treat each other in a way that reflects this remarkable wisdom, this remarkable reordering of life in your mind that is grounded in this story and the God behind the story, not all the things you grew up with telling you how life had to be.
Well, that's wonderful, Mark. I've just been sitting here with my head spinning a little bit because, and the way I handle my head spinning is I'm going to take a deep breath and feed back to you what you've said, because I'm sure people listening will have the same head spinning. But it's very important. I think what you're saying is very important. One parallel story running through my mind as you were talking was from our dear friends in our local Bible study who were grappling. I wasn't there, but they were grappling with Galatians last night and the fruit of the Spirit. And the thing became, as Anne told me, and she did her best to rescue them, a terrible self-flagellation of, we lose our temper in the family. Oh, we do this, this checklist of behaviours. That's what we've got to do. And of course, the attempt to emulate those behaviours is fruitless. It never works. I mean, what you're talking about is what's really going on. And I like the fact that you've grounded it so completely, in this case in Philippians.
Yeah.
The change is bigger. Now, the actual outworking of it could well be that someone lives a more Irenic life, a more compassionate life, and is
A life of love.
a life of love. But you don't get there without a renewal of your mind. So what I've heard you say is that we've taken this word knowledge and we've started to amplify it, move it across into wisdom. Let's use that word, and that it is. Now, wisdom is the corollary of truth, which is light. So you need, if you're wise, you'll get the story right. So the story is what's going to give light.
Yeah.
And you began in Acts 17 and talked about the way he began with their current belief systems and unpacked them to reveal a incipient hope, an incipient, they wouldn't use the word love, but I'm in something bigger, and mystery, which is really a faith type word. But he took those and said, look, you'll never get this right. These instincts that are in you, they're from being made in God's image. But you need the right story to instruct you. Going back to where I began with Isaiah, that phrase I read this morning, Isaiah 50, that he has given me an instructed tongue, Now you then went and said, well, the actual story makes no sense without the ending.
Yeah.
And we know that's true in literature. That's actually quite a profound point. The ending of the story. The question is, what's the ending? Yeah. And you've gone to the incarnation and the resurrection, and which is exactly where Paul went to in Acts 17. But then you took us to Philippians 2, which in a sense is an amplification of Acts 17, because Acts 17 is obviously a summary of what he said. Acts 17 was about the resurrection and the rule of this man, and I think the judgment, which clearly is a challenge to Augustus Caesar.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm now talking about the rule of the world. Of course, my mind goes to Hebrews 2, and Psalm 8, Now, this rule, what it's all about.
Paul writes this from a Roman cell to people living in one of the major Roman colonies of the world, Philippi.
Oh, that makes it even bigger, because what we see in Philippians 2, as you said, is so the word you've given us is the wisdom word, phronesis, or its cognate.
Yeah. And
I think very importantly, you made the point in verse 5, your attitude should be the same. And then as you talked, you used some other phrases, Romans 12, let this mind be in you. Now, all these words they're just connotations of knowing and knowledge.
Yeah, that's right.
But in a much more ethical, rich way. So this way of knowing, this way of being, this wisdom should be in you as in Christ. Then you went through the story. Interestingly, the story that he records in 6 to 11 of Philippians. Again, I was going to say I don't want to labour this point. I do want to labour it. Makes no mention of sin, no mention of the traditional forensic punishment for sin. It doesn't mention that. It's an incarnational journey to resurrection, to suffering and resurrection. That's his story. And that story is the story of that gives us, to bring it back to faith, hope and love. Yeah. That we are, it's ultimate hope, ultimate meaning, to do with all of life. If you get this story right in your mind, this story will instruct you, because it'll frame hope, it'll enrich and explain love. This is the love is multi-layered. The love God has for us and the love God shows. Yeah. And
so can I bring something else into this?
Yeah.
Is you're saying that, and I've emphasized that it's so important to know the ending of the story. What's also really important, and I know you've been a great advocate of this, is knowing the beginning of the story.
Yes.
And that in many ways, the whole thing about wisdom and knowledge, one way you can look at it is to say it is about returning to being human as we were intended to be, right? And except now shaped after the resurrection, shaped after the second Adam, not the first Adam. If you go back, and I know we've talked about this before, but I'm not sure whether folks listening to this will have heard us talk about this or not. But if you go back to the beginning, the first few chapters of the Bible, I've long been intrigued by this whole thing about the two trees that are there. The tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, it's really important to recognize, to see what that second tree is. It's not the tree of the knowledge of evil. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay? That the fruit of this tree is that I see the world in terms of good and evil. Now, the narrative makes it really clear that only enters into the picture after they dispute God's character and place in their lives and seek to be independent. And from then on, their lives are indeed characterized by this knowledge of good and evil. Now, if you just wind back a little bit, if you imagine the picture that is painted of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, so here's the world made and these, extraordinary patterns of the first 6 days. And in chapter 2, you've got the man and the woman filling this, and amazing things. Now, if you imagine, just imagine that story went on and on and on and on and on and on, okay, without any Genesis 3. Then you've got people doing all the things they were meant to do. So creating music and hybridizing tomatoes and building towns and coming up with novel ideas in geometry and leverage and engineering, not to mention having children. And all of this is exactly what they're intended to do, right? That is to be the image of God. That is to reflect the one who is the designer and maker of all things, the one who holds up all things by sheer love and relationship, okay? Now imagine that just goes on and on and on and on and on. But there is no knowledge of good and evil. In other words, there is no need for it. There is no reference point. Now you and I and everybody else, we find it incredibly difficult to think about life other than in binary terms. Right and wrong, good and bad, in or out, acceptable, unacceptable, meeting the grade or not meeting the grade. Our lives, if you try it as a sort of thought experiment, it's incredibly difficult to sort of wash ourselves of this kind of binary way of thinking. If you think about, as you and I have seen in the corporate context, just how pervasive the idea of performance is. Now, we're not silly. We can see its pragmatic value at certain places, but we see over and over again where it goes way beyond that. It goes to a marking of the true value and nature of human beings. Now, imagine back in that earlier scenario, you've got all this wonderful design and industry and relationship going on. It simply does not need good and evil as any reference point. It would be a nonsense, is what you're doing good? Well, yeah, because God made it all and said it's very good. Oh, are you worried about evil? I'm not sure what you're talking about. I'm sorry, I don't have any idea about that. Whereas from Genesis 3 onwards, everything's coloured by that. Now, if you roll forward to Jesus and you look at his life, like the categories of good and evil just don't work. If you try to characterize his life, like when he breaks the Sabbath, which the gospel writers are very frank in admission that he does, right? Is that evil? Because he's done the wrong thing. Well, there's nothing in the narrative at all that would lead you to that conclusion about Jesus. But what you get is, and is faith, hope, and love. So I'm jumping around, but if you go back to that garden scenario of chapter 2, going on and on and on, they know by faith, hope, and love. It's not something that is kind of a post-fall condition. I mean, how do they have true knowledge? The true knowledge is dependent upon God. That is faith. I recognize I'm not the center of the universe. You are. I recognize I didn't make all these things. You made these things. I recognize that I'm given this incredible room for agency and industry, but I still take my cues from you. in terms of how things are. But I also recognize that we are the very industry of what we do. We are magnifying the glory of God. There's this hope dimension to it. And in all of it, it is all just this extraordinary experience of relationship, of love, and of beauty. That's how I keep knowing truly, is that I keep being in wonder at God and who he is and what he's done and who we are and all the rest of it. Now you come to Jesus, and all of his knowledge is in his being is characterized by faith. That is, he constantly makes reference to his Father. I know who I am because of who my Father is. My Father has given me the things to do. I know who I am because of my place in the story of Israel. All right. So it's not I'm independent, I don't need any of that to know truly. It's no, I know truly because I am grounded in that. And it's not about independence or autonomy. In all of his knowing, it is, you think of his parable, telling of the parable, every parable is about the kingdom, the kingdom, the kingdom, the kingdom. Something is coming, and it's going to blow all of your expectations. And of course, the big one is love. It's the Father's love for him. It's his love for the Father. It's his love for his disciples. It's his love for the cosmos, for the world. And those things are shaping every single thing that he does, all the way through. And so it is that and I know you shared this, we've argued that as important as the death of Jesus is, and it really is, and I don't for a moment want to minimize that. And I think, that it's still important to be able to talk about sin and forgiveness and whatever else. But the point of the story is not the crucifixion. The point of the story is the resurrection. The crucifixion is the thing that must happen in order to get to the resurrection, because it's at the resurrection that the second man is created. The new Adam is revealed. And likewise, then, when you think about what it means to live within this, so you take that Philippians thing again, how do I orient myself? If the world isn't about good and evil, if that's not my reference point, if my reference point is the wonder of God and what he has done in Christ, then this upside down story of Philippians 2, 6-11 leads me to the upside down relationships of verses 1-4, where all the kind of ways that I've got of demarcating the world as you're right and you're wrong and you're good and you're not, and you're up here and you're down there, they just go. They just go. And what I find is that I engage in a way that I never have before. And if you're Paul, it means you can go up onto the Areopagus hill, and without going through all kinds of stuff that you can imagine Isaiah would have gone through, and just say, let me declare to you what you already know, but you don't know. And likewise in Galatians, the fruit of the Spirit, they don't map at all across good and evil. What they are is reflections of, as we are now renewed in the mind of Christ, this is what life looks like. And I love the little last verse, and against these things there's no law. In other words, law just doesn't have a place in the conversation.
No.
That was a long ramble. I'm finished.
Mark, I was just sitting here, joining with you in that, because we need language, and we need to share with our friends language to talk about this wonderful good news. It's our job. And, I won't add much to what you're going to say, but what I was hearing is it's the story, and the story had to be the story of a human being.
Yeah,
that's what the story had to be. It's
had to be.
If I think about good and evil, what my mind goes to, that does fit into axioms, commandments, policies, behaviors. But when I think about life, I got to think about a person.
Absolutely.
And that the truth of the story it wasn't going to climax in a set of prophecies. It wasn't going to climax in a set of axioms and commandments, or it wasn't going to climax in some abstracted philosophies. It wasn't going to climax in scientific discoveries. It had to climax in a person.
Yeah.
And that person, as you said, the reason the resurrection is the center of Paul's thinking in Acts 17 and here is the resurrection is the new creation. That's what we are now part of. We're part of life. Yeah. And as you said, the a way of making this. It's almost like the rays of light that emanate from this new person. The language which people would see in us naturally would be love, faith, hope, and love as wisdom. Why? So wise living is not a set of proverbs. It's actually a growing grasp of the person who is Christ, and therefore the people we are.
Absolutely. I can't think of a better place for us to finish this, Tony.
No. All right. Well, I think it certainly deserves at least one more conversation, my friend.
Be great.
Okay. Have a good day.
Good to be with you, mate. Bye.
Bye-bye.